Welcome everyone to CEJA's 8th Annual Environmental Justice Scorecard briefing. Today we'll be discussing our 2020 EJ Scorecard and presenting our 2021 priority issues. We're dropping a link to the agenda in the chat box so that you can follow along today. As folks are signing on, I invite everyone to introduce yourselves by typing into the chat box your name, community, and organization. You may also like to share why you're here or what you hope to get out of today's briefing. So let's see if folks can chat that in, and I'll put an example. So my name is Cassie Manjikian. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles on Hahamongna Tongva land, and I'm CEJA's Special Projects Manager. I'm really excited to see everyone and discuss our EJ Scorecard to hold our state elected officials accountable to improve their performance on environmental justice. I see we have 70 folks participating today. It's so great to virtually see all of you. We have folks introducing themselves with EOPA. Welcome, Megan. Welcome 350.org, Kathy. And as those introductions are coming in, I'd also like to give a special thanks to all those who made the 2020 scorecard happen. So here it is. CEJA's members and partner organizations APEN, CRPE, Leadership Council, and PSRLA, as well as thank you to the Resources Legacy Fund for its generous support. After the briefing, we'll send you a link to download the scorecard in English, Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. And I'll now pass it to CEJA's Executive Director, Gladys Limon. Gladys, you're on mute.
Thank you, Cassie. Good afternoon. I'm Gladys Limon and proudly serve as Thank you for joining our 2020 EJ Scorecard briefing. I hope you, your colleagues, and loved ones find yourselves in good health and with support during this continued difficult time. CEJA unites the powerful local organizing of our members in communities most impacted by pollution and other environmental hazards, low-income communities and communities of color, to build power and advance policy solutions statewide. Led by our 10-member and partner organizations throughout the state, we're recognized for achieving groundbreaking wins and shaping public discourse on transformative climate, energy, and green zones policies. We're proud to release our 8th annual EJ Scorecard for the 2020 legislative session. Our scorecard reflects a historic, deeply challenging year for EJ communities who faced and continue to face multiple crises of racial injustice, the pandemic, an economic recession, and increased climate disasters. In light of these crises, legislative health protections and equity measures in 2020 should have been unassailable. The crises have magnified the direct impacts that environmental conditions and systemic racism have on people's health and well-being. It is undeniable that our elected officials' decisions on policies on everything from policing, healthcare, the siting of life-endangering polluting sources, from sprawling warehouses to oil drilling, and budget allocations continue to undermine the fundamental health and longevity of the lives of low-income communities and communities of color. Environmental justice must be prioritized by our lawmakers. And yet, despite tremendous advocacy efforts by frontline communities in 2020, our lawmakers largely failed to assume this responsibility. They rejected measures to create equitable alternatives to policing and allowed industry lobbyists to drown out the voices of frontline community members asking for common sense protections for their families' health and safety. As the 2021 legislative session begins, we hope our scorecard can serve as a tool that inspires new pathways forward that see our representatives carry the mantle of climate and environmental justice. CEJA's EJ principles can serve as a guide for how legislative staff in the Capitol community can integrate environmental justice into their work. The first principle is to prioritize and value harm prevention, human health, and improved quality of life. This means not overlooking health impacts in favor of business interests or so-called cost effectiveness. The second is do no harm. Actions should not result in increased pollution or worse health outcomes for communities. Third, prioritize environmental justice communities, both to confront the historic legacy of disinvestment in high pollution areas, and also to recognize the current state of affairs in our neighborhoods. Fourth, meaningful community engagement. Decision makers should partner with local communities to solicit input and be responsive to concerns and be transparent to ensure continued engagement and accountability. The fifth principle is to be proactive. Reach out to impacted groups for ideas and feedback. The next principle is to take an intersectional approach. Policy solutions should address the many intersecting issues impacting EJ communities to the extent possible. Next is be responsive. We need continued dialogue and follow through until solutions are reached. The last principle is respecting community expertise. Scientific data often takes a long time to verify issues that communities have raised for years. Decision makers should respect what communities tell you as truthful, valid, and worth acting upon in its own right to inform more equitable policy. And now I'd like to introduce two state legislators who successfully embodied these principles in 2020 and were selected by our alliance as 2020 EJ champions, Assemblymember Rob Bonta and Assemblymember Al Murtuzachi. We're honored to have them join us today to address why they decided to take leadership and author bills on environmental justice in 2020, why it's important to truly represent EJ communities, especially in this historic moment of multiple crises, and what's the importance and role of EJ community advocates in partnering with legislators on our priorities. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Assemblymember Al Murtuzachi. He was elected in 2012 to represent the 66th Assembly District in the South Bay of Los Angeles County. For the last 2 years, he authored AB 345, a landmark bill to protect communities living near inherently dangerous oil extraction operations, and fought hard for its passage. He has not hesitated to use his political capital to help advance the issues of those most impacted by environmental harms and lifting their priorities. Please join me in virtually welcoming Assemblymember Murtuzachi.
Actually, I'm so sorry. I don't think the assembly member is with us right now. I think our Zoom capacity was maxed out at 100 folks, so we might need to look into that. Maybe while we're looking into that, Gladys, can you introduce Sylvia, and we can move on to the next part of our agenda while we get the assembly members
Absolutely.
online?
Yes, yeah, we apologize for that technical challenge. I'll introduce Sylvia Chi, Policy Director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, one of our core member organizations, who will discuss CEJA's 2020 EJ Scorecard.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sylvia Chi, and I use she or they as pronouns, and I'm coming to you from Oakland on Ohlone land, and serve as the Policy Director for APEN. I'll be discussing CEJA's 8th Annual EJ Scorecard, which we'll be releasing today at the end of the briefing. CEJA's member and partner organizations led the creation of the scorecard as the only one in California that grades legislators exclusively on their environmental justice voting record. As Gladys discussed, 2020 was a challenging year marked by chaos and disappointment for environmental justice communities. The pandemic and climate disasters laid bare California's deep racial and class inequalities as working class communities of color face the greatest risks with the least access to stable housing, healthcare, and good family supporting jobs. Next slide. Thanks. So the criteria for selecting bills and scoring. The scorecard is based on legislators' votes on only specific bills. The bills we chose to score were selected based on 3 main criteria. Either CEJA itself or a member or partner organization formally supported it or opposed it. It was a significant policy proposal for environmental justice communities, and it demonstrates environmental justice principles, which Gladys just described. And the scores were based on whether the member voted in alignment with CEJA's position And just as a note, we score unexcused abstentions as votes. And this year we added a new community score. So each CEJA org was given the opportunity to add or deduct from members' computed score based on how that member demonstrated those environmental justice principles. And this was our attempt to integrate some more qualitative aspects into the scorecard. Next slide. So as you can see, we had a wide variety of bills that we scored members on, touching on issue areas from setbacks for oil and gas extraction to support for renters, affirmative action, and workers' rights for domestic workers. Next slide. I think we skipped a slide. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, 2020 was a chaotic and unusual year for the legislature because of the COVID disruptions. And unfortunately, the upshot for CEJA was that members did not support our priorities as they have in previous years. So while we're dismayed and disappointed that so many legislators failed to support, to uphold EJ principles and support our policies solutions during this critical time of overlapping crises, we celebrate the small group of legislators who were unwavering in their commitment to environmental justice. Next slide. So we believe that addressing racial justice is necessary to address environmental justice and vice versa. So as usual, this scorecard includes an analysis of the Asian Pacific Islander Caucus, the Black Caucus, and the Latino Caucus. As shown here, all three ethnic caucuses performed less well than in 2019. But we hope that as these overlapping crises continue to expose the link between environmental and racial inequality and economic and health outcomes, among other things, that these scores improve in 2021 and beyond. Next slide. So we also scored Governor Newsom's record following the same methodology. Unfortunately, his score dropped from 100% in 2019 to 44% in 2020. Notably, the governor failed to meaningfully support environmental justice priorities that really needed his support to get over the finish line. And that is specifically referencing AB 345 and AB 995. And we believe there remains significant room for growth. Next slide. So we all remain committed to working with the legislature and governor to advance environmental justice for low-income communities and communities of color. We hope this scorecard is used as a tool to strengthen our relationships with the environmental justice champions and help legislators understand our priorities and what it means to join the fight for environmental justice. With that, I'll pass the virtual microphone back to CEJA's Executive Director, Gladys.
Yes.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. I see that we have some space now, and I just want to check in and see if we have Assembly Member Murtuzachi with us now. We do. Okay, great.
Hi, sorry about that. I was trying to unmute myself. I'm here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Assembly Member, for joining us. Okay, you have the floor. Thank you again for making the time to join us, and thank you for all of your leadership.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of you environmental justice warriors out there. I'm Assembly Member Al Murtuzachi, proud author of AB 345. And, you know, I really appreciate all the hard work that CEJA and all of you environmental justice warriors out there do on a day-to-day basis to fight the pollution in our communities, in our backyards, to protect our children, our families, our communities. You know, I'm truly honored to to be recognized as an environmental champion by CEJA because I have so much respect for the organization. One of the questions that I was asked to address is, why did I decide to take on this huge fight, this huge righteous fight, when I was approached by CEJA and the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment? I knew this, the fight that I was going to be getting into, because this is not, unfortunately, this has not been my first rodeo. I represent the South Bay area of Los Angeles County with a lot of oil drilling, a lot of oil refineries. And one of the biggest issues that I've continued to fight is with all the toxic pollution being emitted by a huge refinery in the city of Torrance in my district. And there continues to be an ongoing issue of the Torrance refinery being one of only 2 refineries in the entire state of California that uses this highly toxic chemical, hydrofluoric acid, that has the risk, if it ever escaped from the confines of the refinery, that it can kill hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, there have been worst case scenarios that have been submitted to the EPA by the refinery for emergency planning purposes, where the use of this hydrofluoric acid continues to be a huge threat to all of the families and communities surrounding the refinery. And so, when I took on the Torrance refinery fight, I thought that was my first big lesson, that the fight for environmental justice to protect our communities, unfortunately, is not just against big oil, but there are all of the workers who are represented by the unions in the fossil fuel industry that are a big part of this fight. And for all of you that understand democratic politics, I mean, I'm a proud union supporter. I'm a proud supporting of working men and women, but it becomes a huge challenge when labor is aligned with big oil and fighting against, in the case of the Torrance refinery, with my efforts to try to eliminate the use of this highly toxic hydrofluoric acid, or in the case of fighting for reasonable oil drilling setbacks to protect children and families, schools, health clinics from the hazardous impacts of oil drilling in the backyards of communities, especially too often communities of color. It's a huge problem when we have not only big oil, but the labor unions representing the fossil fuel industry workers that are opposing these efforts. And so I took a hard look at the oil drilling setback issue, about this fight that CEJA and the other organizations that were part of this righteous fight came to talk to me about. And I did not hesitate. I took it on because I know it's a righteous fight. It's the right thing to do. And I will continue to fight this fight with all of you. Unfortunately, the bill died in the Senate Natural Resources Committee last year. Unfortunately, there were too many Democrats as well as Republicans that voted against, that did not support the bill. But we know that the fight continues. Again, I really appreciate this Environmental Justice Champion Award, but I recognize that this is one of those awards where still have a lot of work to earn the award. And so I look forward to continue working with all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join all of you today.
Thank you, Assemblymember Murtuzachi, for your environmental justice leadership and being a champion for our communities. I'd like to now introduce our other distinguished environmental justice champion of 2020, Assemblymember Rob Bonta. He was elected in 2012 to represent the 18th Assembly District as the first Filipino-American state legislator in California. In 2020, he authored AB 1839 to create a California Green New Deal. Assemblymember Bonta has been consistent in his accessibility to and engagement with community members, and in his advocacy for environmental justice issues. Please join me in virtually giving him a warm welcome. Assemblymember Bonta.
And again, sorry, I think he's signing on in a few minutes, Gladys.
I see. Okay.
So maybe we can, yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, as we wait for Assemblymember Bonta to join, we'll move on, and there's lots to talk about today. And so we can talk about, we can start talking about what our members and partners are holding as their environmental justice priorities for 2021. And if at any point you have any questions, please type those into the chat box. We'll save all of the questions for after the presentations. So I will go next to introduce Ingrid Brostrom, Assistant Director for CRPE, the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, who will discuss CRPE's and CEJA's work to reform DTSC, the Department of Toxics and Substances Control. Ingrid.
Great, thank you so much. And again, my name is Ingrid Brostrom, Assistant Director at the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. We are based in Kern County. You know, I'm probably a familiar face at these ledge briefings, as I've been talking about DTSC reform for many, many years. And to start, this issue is so incredibly important because a well-functioning DTSC is so very critical for residents who live near hazardous waste facilities and cleanup sites, which we know are overwhelmingly in environmental justice communities. So when DTSC fails, hazardous waste facilities may not be properly monitored or regulated, which can lead to violations that put residents at risk. Hazardous waste laws may not be enforced, which can lead to illegal dumping in EJ communities. And cleanups may not be conducted, leaving residents at risk of exposure to spreading contamination. So failures at DTSC spread throughout its program areas and ultimately its communities of color and low-income communities that pay the very large price. Something new this year is that we've heard new estimates about the number of cleanup sites that we believe are waiting to be investigated and cleaned up. We now think there are up to 200,000 sites scattered throughout California that have not previously been investigated or characterized. And for comparison, right now, California is only overseeing the cleanup at 1,800 sites. So the magnitude of the problem we are facing is staggering. In fact, some of you may have seen a report released just today about Quemeco, which is California's other lead battery recycler. And I think it's pretty clear that we may have another Exide-like situation on our hands. So this is not the time to give up on DTSC and not the time to let this issue go. Now, I've been working on this issue for a very long time. EJ groups have been asking for reform and a board structure for 8 years. And we can't work to address the systemic issues at DTSC on a site-by-site basis, and that's why we need wholesale reform to help all the communities facing toxic risks. And yet every year we're told to be patient, that even though it's a high priority and relief is coming, that it won't be coming now, and we can't afford to wait anymore. DTSC is now insolvent, communities are in crisis, and DTSC reform must pass this year. So the bottom line that we want to see in DTSC reform is a transparent, accountable, and accessible board with a public-facing decision-making process. We want to see a revamped and updated hazardous waste management plan, including hazardous waste reduction goals, and also plans to reach that goal. We want to see a pollution prevention program that will reduce waste upstream and promote cleaner industrial processes. And we know we need fee reform with structures that incentivize reductions in the amount and toxicity of hazardous waste generated. CRPE is supporting AB1, and we are committed to working with both the legislature and the administration to align around these common goals. We must work together and get this done this year. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Gladys.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. And luckily, we are now joined by Assemblymember Bonta. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your leadership. Assemblymember?
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. Good to see everybody. Good afternoon. Rob Bonta in the California State Assembly, proudly representing Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro, and hope all of you and your friends and families, loved ones are all healthy, safe, and well, and just deeply appreciate the opportunity to share this space with all of you. Thank you so much to CEJA for the honor of the 2020 Environmental Justice Champion. I understand that my good friend and colleague, Assemblymember Murtuzachi, was on earlier. Congratulations to him. Always proud and thankful to share the stage with him. But really just want to say thank you to you for your leadership, and for me to be able to partner with you has been just a great pleasure, whether it be the California Green New Deal, which we work side by side on to address and face and confront the existential threat of our time, while embedding it and imbuing it with the equity lens that is necessary. That fight continues, and I appreciate CEJA's role and leadership and strong and powerful voice in always uplifting our most vulnerable, our most disadvantaged, those members of our community that live at the intersection of poverty and contamination, pollution, and injustice, and fighting for better lives for them. And pushing an agenda that looks through that equity lens, which we all in California need to be looking through, which always uplifts those who are hurt most and hurt first and hurt worst, providing them the most assistance and getting them to the front of the line with the work that we do. So we continue to have a all hands on deck, all tools in the toolbox challenge in front of us. It has not been made any easier with the challenges of COVID-19 and the economic recession, which has really just laid bare the existing inequities and injustices that we knew existed. And so that means that the folks that we care for, that we fight for, that need champions, that need voices, need us even more. So we have a lot of work ahead, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity to work with you in partnership with you, with the values and the shared values that we have to create better lives for so many Californians. So honored for this recognition, but mostly just want to take the opportunity in this space to thank you for your ongoing leadership and let you know how eager I am and excited I am to continue our partnership to help folks who need it most. So thank you so much, CEJA.
Thank you, Assemblymember Bonta, for sharing your wisdom with us, and congratulations on being selected by our members and partners as an Environmental Justice Champion for the 2020 legislative session. Now, everyone who is with us today, if you could please join me in thanking Assembly members Bonta and Murtuzachi. Please come off of mute for a moment so that we can give them a live applause for their environmental justice leadership.
Yay! Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we started hearing from our members and partners about their 2021 environmental justice priorities, starting with Ingrid from CRPE, and she let us know about the priority critical issue of reforming the DTSC. And now we will hear from Martha Arguello, Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, and she will be discussing PSRLAs and CEJA's work to advance oil and gas setbacks. Martha.
Good afternoon, everybody. As many of you know, PSRLA and the Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling Coalition and many members of CEJA and other groups have been fighting for a very long time to address the health impacts and the, well, primarily the health and environmental impacts of urban oil drilling and oil drilling throughout the state of California. In 2017, a study found that an estimated 2.1 million Californians live within 1 mile of an actively producing well, oil and gas well. And yet very few studies have been done. But what we do know is that communities have come forward and are demanding that the health impacts that they're experiencing be addressed in the form of health and safety setbacks. And as we heard earlier, this has been primarily a battle about what does our new economy look like and how far will we go to protect an economy that puts 2.1 million Californians at risk for asthma, for cancer, for low birth weight, for both the chronic and acute health impacts of living next to this dangerous practice that happens dangerously close to people, for which we have a perfectly safe alternative. So it really speaks to the need to, one, begin plotting that just transition. So we will be back. We will continue to fight for the setbacks. We are not a community that gives up. And we also know that justice takes a long time, and we wish that it didn't. So we are very committed to continuing with the setbacks bill, but really, how do we now begin to talk to our brothers and sisters in labor? The just transition is going to come. Well, a transition will come. The only way that we guarantee that it will be a just one is if workers and communities living fence line to these oil drilling sites come together to find a solution that supports the workers. We need to fight against the disinformation that has been spread by the oil industry. These jobs will not go away overnight. We will transition them. The setbacks incorporate ways to do this, but we also, why we need this bill is, one of the things we know well is regulatory failure and the inertia of regulatory agencies to actually achieve justice for people. That is just not something California has been good at. And so today, on the day that President Biden announces his executive order on climate, I think it's important for legislators to look at that executive order and see the place of justice. 15 times in that executive order, it mentions justice. So we cannot achieve that justice without putting workers and communities first and moving beyond this regulatory inertia and the inability of our existing regulations to actually put health at the center. So we will continue to fight for bold action from the legislature, bold action from cities and others, so that we can actually protect communities and workers first. Remember, there are more jobs in the caring economy. Imagine basing our economy on caring and restoring and cleaning up those sites, dismantling that fossil fuel infrastructure as we build our clean energy economy. Those are the jobs of the future, and we need, again, we cannot succumb to fear. The transition is in process, and we have to come together as communities to be able to fight for this new future that is not putting our lives on the line so that we can have fossil fuels. There is no climate leadership without stopping drilling where we live.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you so much for sharing those powerful remarks. Now, as a reminder, if anyone has a question for any of our speakers, please type them into the chat box. We are keeping track of them. So until then, next I'd like to introduce Julia Jordan, Policy Coordinator at the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. Julia will discuss the importance of access to decision-making, especially during this historic moment of multiple crises. Julia.
Thank you, Gladys, and the previous speakers, and Cassie and everyone who's helped to organize and put this event together. I appreciate the time and all the work that went into it. So I want to talk about public participation and access to decision-making, which is, a really key tenet of the environmental justice principles that we discussed before. Meaningful participation of those who are most impacted by the environmental injustices and racial and economic injustices that have come up in, the previous two topics, but also throughout all of the work that we do, is a really key part of environmental justice. And it happens through, what they call procedural justice, right? Through the processes that are part of democracy. So the two principles that, the CEJA principles that drive this work are really the meaningful community engagement principle and also the respect of community expertise. So really, including and making sure that decisions are not being made without that expertise, really valuing it enough to include it. So COVID-19 has really required the shift, as most of us know, to virtual participation options, right? And that transition has basically created this whole new opportunity for people who, can't travel for various reasons, whether it's geographic limitation, or they can't take off of work to come to Sacramento for a 2-minute comment, right? lack of transportation, or challenges for people living with disabilities, a whole variety of reasons. But it's also come with a lot of challenges that, you know, people without internet or people who don't speak English as a primary language have to deal with, right? So some of those challenges are new. Like, I think all of us have had to get more familiar with online tools, but most of them existed before COVID, like the language access problem within public meetings. So we see this as an opportunity to improve accessibility to government decision-making at both the local and the state level, in agencies and in the legislature as well. And because COVID has highlighted so many inequalities, public participation is just one of those, right? But it's one that affects all of the other aspects of decision-making and of policy. So, you know, there's a lot of people in the state and local governments who have been working to transition throughout the pandemic, who've been working to improve the system of participation. But we've really also seen a lot of issues, particularly in the regions where Leadership Council works, in the San Joaquin and Eastern Coachella Valleys, where, you know, we're not seeing that good faith effort into really making sure that there's a collaborative process, that in this critical time when decisions are being made about things like resource allocation of COVID dollars from the federal government for housing and for basic needs, that those voices aren't being centered and they're not even being included because there's no capacity for people to even, you know, join in and make public comments. So Leadership Council is working on a bill this year that aims to address, it should be introduced shortly, and it aims to address these issues by essentially ensuring that every single Californian always has an opportunity to join public meetings and make comments in person through a call-in option and also through an internet-based service. So that's obviously when it's safe to do so, right? The in-person part of that. But we're also wanting to make sure that there's translation and interpretation services available for the meetings, that there's the agendas are translated that need to be translated, and that there's a standard for posting and providing notification about meeting agendas and instructions for joining calls ways. So we really need, you know, local and state decision makers to, in good faith, really keep up the process or keep the process as open as possible. But in reality, to do that across the state, we also need policy and we need accountability, and to fight for this alongside and in deep collaboration with the communities that have historically faced those barriers to participation. So, you know, we really hope that everyone can kind of join us in that fight. It goes across all issue areas. It really gets to that core environmental justice principle of meaningful community engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Again, if anyone has questions, please add them to the chat box. And so lastly, we have Sylvia Chi of APEN once again, who will address our collective work to advance a just recovery from COVID and a Green New Deal. Sylvia.
Thanks. So what we just heard about, the other priorities, DTSC reform, oil and gas setbacks, facilitating robust public participation. These are all examples of the strategic investments in community-centered systems change that we need for a just recovery from the current crises. They all point to the need to invest in resilience for communities that face the greatest risks and have the fewest material resources to recover. This year, especially, working class communities of color have been hit hardest by the coronavirus pandemic, wildfires, heat waves, and power shutoffs. APEN organizes in Richmond with Laotian refugees who live alongside the state's largest single pollution source, the Richmond Chevron refinery. The risks from the pandemic and wildfires are heightened for them because so many people already have asthma, respiratory illness, and autoimmune disease from breathing polluted air daily. Cities like Richmond have also experienced decades of disinvestment from public and community resources. That's why we're advocating for deep investments in the community institutions and social supports that stabilize communities every day and that can support people through disasters. APEN is leading the Coalition for a California Green New Deal, representing communities of color, urban and rural neighborhoods, workers, immigrants, environmentalists, and everyday people across California ready to fight for a Green New Deal that puts frontline communities at the forefront of solutions and advances our three pillars of climate, racial, and economic justice. One piece of the California Green New Deal that we're championing in 2021 is a policy that APEN is working on with CEJA and NRDC to fund resilience hubs. And that there's an illustration here of a pilot resilience hub that APEN is working on developing right now in Richmond. And resilience hubs are physical spaces that are already part of the social fabric of a community, places where people go every day to gather, organize, and access services. It's about turning places like schools, libraries, and community centers into resilience hubs that are staffed and equipped to provide food, respite from smoky air, cooling centers, and backup power from solar and storage. We've seen some examples of this type of response happening in recent months, with schools distributing food to families when COVID first hit, but we need to scale up responses like this dramatically. At a time when the state is facing a pandemic, climate crisis, and the start of a global economic recession, we know that there's going to be a lot of pressure to revert to austerity and further weaken the safety net. What we need is the opposite. We need deep investment in people and communities, and funding resilience hubs will be a great start. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you again for your wonderful remarks. And so now we're going to go into question and answer and hopefully have a discussion. Again, we're taking questions from the audience as they're being typed into the chat box. So let's get started with the first question that came in. And this can be for anyone on the panel who wants to speak to this, which is, where was the Women's Caucus on these issues last year? Can anyone speak to what allyship there was, or engagement, or what the possibilities are for this next legislative year? And this question came from Andrea Ventura. Anyone of our member and partner panelists? Okay,
guess we didn't work with them.
Or they didn't step up to the plate. So maybe a work area to consider.
Yeah, can you speak more to that, Andrea?
No, just I was just curious. You know, we were looking at the other caucuses, and we saw a little bit of a drop there. As the Assembly member Banta said, you know, there was a lot of concerns about COVID and all that, and that probably got in the way. Whatever the reasons are, I think the Women's Caucus should be an area too where we can put some attention. And I was just curious if they were stepping up to the plate, or if we just need to put more work into that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate those remarks and the suggestions, and it makes absolute sense for the Women's Caucus to be aligned with us on issues that are so fundamental to the health and well-being of families throughout California. So let's go on to another question for the speakers. Which EJ principle do you believe is most frequently overlooked by decision makers, and how do you recommend that we further incorporate, or that staff and assembly members further incorporate it into their policymaking process?
Boy, I would start with, I think it's important to think about, you know, one of the basic principles about communities' right to decide. And how we've gotten here is a regulatory structure that allows polluters to work with agencies to decide, and then they announce it, and then they defend it. So anything that we can do in legislation to drive more rights for communities to decide is important. And then the other part is you take somewhat okay legislation, and then you give it you put it in the hands of regulatory agencies that have no part of their mission to actually achieve environmental justice. So it should be part of every single public employee's duty statement to be achieving environmental justice and to be able to be held accountable when they fail within agencies. That's just my pet peeve. So that's not a CEJA answer. That's just...
Thanks, Martha. Anyone else?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think, one of the big issues is just the, community members have so much expertise and understanding of their own areas, of their experience of what needs to be done. And I think the process just, there's ways in which it is set up to kind of ignore that expertise. And it takes really that effort to, really intentionally reach out to elevate the things that are being prioritized from folks on the ground who are most impacted by the issues that we're all trying to solve, and then to actually take those seriously in policy. Especially like a lot of the communities we work with have, they're small rural areas, they're unincorporated areas, they're places where there's not going to be always the most accurate data or the most accurate quantitative indicators that we can rely on for decision-making processes. But when you talk to people, they can tell you exactly what's going on. They can tell you about the situation of housing. They can tell you about whether or not there's vacant units, or whether there's a need for transportation infrastructure, or, whether or not a certain system of climate investment is going to work or not, right? So there's the value of really incorporating that information and then valuing it and elevating it to the same level as some of those quantitative data indicators. That is a really critical piece, I think, of all of this, all of the issues that we're talking about.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, let's move on to another question. Rico from Trust for Public Land states that 2019 looks like the anomaly. Otherwise, EJ scores have started declining in 2017. Why was 2019 so much better? And I can speak to that, but I'll pause to see if there's anyone else from CEJA who would like to comment on that. Okay, yeah, so this is really interesting because in 2019, the scores were pretty high. There was an increase from the prior years. And we noted in our scorecard narrative that the reason that we believe that is because the bills that were selected as EJ priorities were lower hanging fruit. The bills were not as transformative, they were not major modifications to infrastructure, to business, and so they were less threatening. So it was a little easier for people to come around and vote in support of those bills versus, for example, AB 345, which is transformative, right? It has different implications. And it's so critical for EJ communities. The DTSC reform, we were able to get that passed in 2020. It went to the governor's desk. Unfortunately, he did not support it at that point. But in prior years, we also have had difficulty in like 2019 moving that reform. So again, anytime that we've tried to move systemic reform bills, or bills that implicate industry, that's where you get a lot of the cool to cold positions. And so again, this is where we need our lawmakers to stand up, particularly to corporate interests, and to stand with those communities whose lives are being impacted and whose health is and life expectancy are being jeopardized because of the state of our current economic infrastructure. So let's move on to another question here from, let's see, Michelle Pritchard. Hi, Michelle, of the Liberty Hill Foundation. Were there any surprises in the 17 legislators who scored 90% or above on the EJ scorecard? And how many legislators might we add to this 90%? column this year. Any takers to Michelle's question? Cassie, do you want to provide any comments in terms of like particularly like new legislators who made it in the top 90%?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I don't know the ins and outs of these legislators specifically. I can just say that, you know, the folks who did earn 90% and above this year, it was only 17 legislators, significantly down from 61 legislators in 2019. So, you know, I think it's just to say that, you know, the folks who did vote with EJ this past year were really few and far between. It was really, you know, pretty disappointing and turbulent year. And that is part of why we're so grateful for champions like Assemblymember Bonta, you know, Murtuzachi, and others who did receive honorable mentions in our card for really standing up. Robert Rivas as well received an honorable mention this year.
Thanks, Cassie. And we only have a few more minutes. We have a question from Linda Hutchins from Mothers Out Front. Hi, Linda. So given how many state legislators receive large contributions from fossil fuel companies, weakening support for EJ issues, what is the hope for campaign finance reform to reduce their influence? Or who would like to speak to this, whether it's about campaign finance reform or just to the issue of the influence that fossil fuel deep pockets have on the ability of, you know, to increase EJ champions and to garner support for environmental justice priority issues?
I can't speak too much to the probability of any campaign finance, but what I can speak to is I think there's growing efforts to calculate how much legislators are receiving from, you know, different oil and gas interests, and comparing that with their votes. And so I think we're going to see more information about that coming out, because we need to call attention to this before we can really change the situation. I think we've all in our gut known, you know, that if you're receiving money and contributions from, you know, from industry or different interest groups, you're more likely to vote in alignment with those interest groups. And so I think now is the time we need to calculate that and really sunlight that information. So I know that there's several groups right now that are doing just that. So I think we have some more information that'll be forthcoming.
Thanks, Ingrid. Martha, do you have anything to add to this? I know you've done some work on this issue as well.
Well, you know, yes, I think we need campaign finance reform. I think we actually need a new narrative, and that we need to work with legislators if you need more information, but it isn't jobs versus the environment. And we've really got to break that narrative and that story. And otherwise we're stuck here, right? Where labor will sign up because the idea of, you know, we will have more jobs, but we need champions in the legislature to champion what the just transition looks like. And there are more jobs, and there are jobs for pipe fitters and others in building moving away from that infrastructure. But more importantly, there's jobs in the restoration of our communities that have been damaged. Our air, water, and soil, and our bodies have been damaged, and we have to stop the harm and then repair it. And those are the jobs of the future. And I think that that's where we need really boldness from the legislature, right? There's that term in economics, creative destruction. And you are, you know, I hated the term, but now that I'm working on just transition, I'm like, oh, okay, I shouldn't have yelled at my econ professor. Because so I just think, you know, we can do a lot, but it's going to take our electeds being bolder and telling us we need to start the transition now, otherwise those jobs will be gone. They will be like coal jobs, and they are not coming back, and no amount of promise or using their money and influence is going to change that.
Thanks, Martha. We definitely need our elected representatives to be on the side of communities and not in the pockets of industry. And we know that there are many efforts that have been spearheaded, for example, to get pledges from elected officials to not take any contributions from the fossil fuel industry, like from Climate Hawks vote. And now there are increased efforts to identify those specific contributions. And we should have already been in a place where any accepting contributions from the fossil fuel industry, is completely just out of the question, where it's like a taboo issue because of the harms that it's causing to our species as well as to communities at the front lines. Unfortunately, that's not the case yet. And so we hope that all of you on this call join us in that effort. So we are out of time for our Q&A. I saw a lot of additional questions coming in. I appreciate those, and hopefully we can continue to have these conversations in other forums. So before we close, I have a request to all of you, and that is to do a group photo. So we're going to momentarily stop screen sharing so that we can capture a group shot. So please take a moment to straighten up, smile, give us your best to be a part of our group photo.
Okay, let's do one more. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Isa. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so we are closing now. We hope that you found our briefing interesting and informative. We look forward to additional lawmakers joining the roster of EJ champions and of growing the community of advocates working with us and other EJ advocates, working for fundamental, critical climate and environmental solutions that protect the health and safety of those that are most bearing the harms of our current fossil fuel-based economy and polluting systems, and who are working hard for a just transition to ensure that all communities can thrive. So thank you again for attending CEJA's 8th Annual Environmental Justice Scorecard Legislative Briefing. We're now dropping into the chat box the link for you to download our 2020 EJ Scorecard report. And we'll also be emailing this to you immediately after the briefing. We encourage you to read and share the report widely. And please let us know if you would like to further discuss it. Before we go, I'd like to give a special thanks to CEJA's members and partners for their incredible work on the scorecard and the briefing, especially APEN, CRPE, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and PSRLA. And again, we're grateful to the Resources Legacy Fund for its generous support that made the scorecard possible. And lastly, we invite you to submit a quick evaluation about our briefing, which we'll also include in the email, and we're also dropping into the chat box now. And we look forward to our continued work together with all of you to advance EJ policies in California and to ultimately improve the on-the-ground realities for EJ communities. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.